Welcome back to United States history, everybody. Today we are going to learn about Teddy Roosevelt and his ventures into the progressive movement. Oh, by the way, he's pro-progressive. You should know that by now. Here we go. Concepts for today. Who is Theodore Roosevelt and what was his involvement with progressivism? Compare the similarities and differences between the progressive movement at the federal and local levels. Finally, who is Upton Sinclair, who you should know by now? For which book is he most known, which you should know by now? And relate his investigation into the meatpacking industry to progressivism, industrialization, immigration, and urbanization, which you should be able to do by now. Here we go. Square deal, that is the key vocabulary word for today, and the square deal has to do with the federal reforms that take place under Theodore Roosevelt when he is president. It's already been mentioned that he is pro-progressive, and because he is pro-progressive and because he is president of the United States, he has influence on quite a few things, and he's able to get some pro-progressive movement legislature through Congress and hopefully for the better of all society. So let's see how that comes into play. Teddy Roosevelt, he comes to power, becomes president of the United States at 42 years old, I believe. So he is a fairly young president. He had already established himself politically prior to becoming president, but had also gained much notoriety during the Spanish-American role and his involvement with the Rough Riders. However, that is all going to be discussed in the next unit, not this one's. Our focus here is with Theodore Roosevelt and the progressive movement. So let's discuss Teddy Roosevelt and his square deal, because this is really any progressive action that he takes. It's basically it basically revolves around this square deal idea. And the first area we can take a look at is big business. And what he becomes known as is the trust buster. And we've discussed trust in earlier videos, and we've certainly discussed monopolies. And the idea of a monopoly, again, is simply that a person will corner a market, have control of that market, and then they can do whatever they want with the prices. Well, if there are two people that have large sums of those markets, it may be next to impossible to get that monopoly. Okay. Well, a trust is when these two sides come together and then basically form a monopoly because they have they own so much of the market. Teddy Roosevelt sees this idea of monopolies and the fact that capitalism, in the way it stands in the early 1900s, this is bad for business. This is destroying competition. He does see it as a bad thing at this time, and he gets involved. He also gets involved in fighting corruption on railroads. He gets involved in strikes, and when he does get involved, it means the government is getting involved. Okay, and he's setting a new precedent in these terms. Another area we can look at with Teddy Roosevelt and his square deal is health. And this is where Teddy Roosevelt is certainly impacted by Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. And he, like many, are just disgusted with the lack of cleanliness found inside the meatpacking industry and what is experienced by the workers that work there and what is told then by the muckraker Sinclair. And true to form, Teddy Roosevelt says he'll do something about it and does. And in 1906 he passes the Meat Inspection Act, which requires certain cleanliness expectations in the meatpacking industry. And that is at the same time, both in 1906, he also passes the Pure Food and Drug Act, which requires that labeling on certain items must be truthful and things cannot be contaminated. And if you think about where we're at today, the idea of something being contaminated and a labeling being false just doesn't sit true with us. Companies would face possible lawsuits. 100 years ago, this was a little over 100 years ago, this was just business. They could get away with it. A final area we can look at with the square deal is the environment. And Teddy Roosevelt is something of a nature nut. He does involve himself with nature in the wilderness, and we see that kind of get involved with the progressive movement or his goals as president. And the Industrial Revolution, one thing that it has created is really a new level of pollution that that countries or cities specifically are really now starting to give out. And he starts to confront some of that with conservation policies for wilderness. This is just the beginning of a long road toward trying to protect the environment, one that is still being fought today, but he does include that in some of his square deal. The last thing we're going to mention before I let you go today is the idea of African Americans and exactly where are they at this point. And we're going to dedicate the next lesson to that. But the main thing here is progressivism doesn't really include, at least not on a very large scale, does not include the idea or the willpower to help African Americans. So exactly where is their standing today? Do they even need help from a movement like progressivism? We'll find that out next time. Until then, adios, amigos.